Good evening. I'm Jim Lehrer in Washington.
And I'm Judy Woodruff in New York. After the news summary, we take a close look at the indictments against Washington movers and shakers Clark Clifford and Robert Altman for their role in the BCCI banking scandal. Then Elizabeth Brackett reports on efforts to stop dads from skipping out on child support. Next, Europe's latest refugee crisis. What to do with 2.5 million displaced citizens of Yugoslavia. And finally, an Amai Wallach essay about the living art of Pablo Picasso.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
Clark Clifford was indicted today on bribery and other charges growing out of the BCCI banking scandal. So was his law partner, Robert Altman. Clifford is the 85-year-old former defense secretary and advisor to Democratic presidents. He and Altman, who is 45, were charged in separate New York state and federal indictments. The state charges were for bribery and for lying about BCCI's secret ownership of the Washington-based First American Bank shares. Clifford was the bank's chairman, Altman its president. The federal charges were for enriching themselves through secret sweetheart loans, among other things. Clifford and Altman issued a written statement saying the indictments were a result of mean-spirited suspicion and unfounded speculation. They said there was no credible evidence of any wrongdoing. We'll have much more on this story right after the news summary. Judy?
The United Nations inspection of Iraq's agriculture ministry in Baghdad ended today. The inspectors found no weapons-related documents or materials in the building. What they did find were signs that materials may have been removed during the 3-week delay in getting access to the building. We have a report narrated by Vera Frankel of Worldwide Television News.
The UN inspectors have, almost predictably, drawn a blank. Nothing relating to Iraq's weapons programs was found inside the Agriculture Ministry. But the inspectors are concerned that some important material might have been spirited out of the building during the 17-day standoff. It's been a difficult time for the head of the UN Commission, Rolf Ekéus, and his team. Their first attempt to get into the ministry building was frustrated by the Iraqi authorities, and stalemate followed. Saddam Hussein relented only after winning concessions from the UN. A new inspection team, drawn from what he regarded as neutral countries, was finally allowed into the ministry. The Iraqis have done their best to ridicule the inspectors' efforts. A television broadcast highlighted their search of unlikely places and also the burgling techniques they used to get past locked doors. Saddam claims to have won the showdown. He was even seen on television taking a symbolic victory dip in the river Tigris.
The U.S. today accused Iraq of continuing to defy the UN ceasefire agreement with repeated attacks on its Shiite population. The U.S. is preparing a new UN Security Council resolution demanding Iraq stop the attacks. The U.S. ambassador to the UN said the new resolution could come before the Council within the week. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Baker met in Washington with Iraqi opposition leaders. The Shiite, Sunni, and Kurdish leaders have appealed for U.S. economic aid to help them in their effort to oust Saddam Hussein. The U.S. reportedly will send Patriot anti-aircraft missiles to Bahrain this week. Pentagon officials told the Reuters news agency the missiles will protect moderate Gulf states from possible attack by Iraq. They said Iraq may still have some Scud missiles left over from the Gulf War. The move follows a shipment of Patriots earlier in the week to Kuwait. Former East German leader Erich Honecker returned to Germany today to face trial. The 79-year-old communist had been in Moscow since he was ousted from office by pro-democracy forces 17 months ago. He is accused of ordering the deaths of hundreds of East Germans trying to flee to the West. Honecker ruled East Germany for 18 years.
And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to the BCCI indictments, deadbeat dads, Yugoslav refugees, and an Amai Wallach essay.
First tonight are some prominent indictments in the BCCI banking scandal. BCCI is the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, a $20 billion financial institution that operated in more than 70 countries until last year, when regulators around the world shut its doors amid charges of fraud and corruption. In the United States, law officials have focused on BCCI's illegal control of 3 banks, including First American bank shares of Washington, D.C. Monday, one of the key figures in that takeover, a former head of Saudi Arabian intelligence, pleaded guilty to violations of banking laws. Today, 2 prominent Americans found themselves facing criminal charges for their alleged involvement with BCCI. 85-year-old Clark Clifford is one of the elder statesmen of Washington, an advisor to Democratic presidents from Truman to Carter. Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson, he was a power broker with an impeccable reputation until the BCCI scandal. His former law firm specialized in helping corporate clients find their way through the bureaucracy of the federal government. Clifford began representing BCCI in the late 1970s with the help of his young protege and fellow attorney Robert Altman. Altman is also well known in Washington social circles for his marriage to actress Linda Carter, star of the 1970s television series Wonder Woman. In 1977, Clifford and Altman represented Jimmy Carter's budget director, Burt Lance, before the Senate on ethics charges relating to Lance's alleged improprieties at his Georgia bank. Soon after, Lance introduced them to Pakistani banker Agha Hassan Abadi, founder of BCCI, who wanted to penetrate the lucrative American banking industry. Clifford and Altman then began to represent a group of wealthy Arab investors openly backed by BCCI. They were trying to take over a Washington bank company, Financial General Bank Shares. With federal regulators leery even then of BCCI's questionable banking practices, the efforts were unsuccessful. Then in 1981, Clifford and Altman went to the Federal Reserve with a new, expanded group of Middle Eastern investors who wanted to buy Financial General. Still suspicious, regulators wanted to know if BCCI was behind the plan. Clifford assured them, quote, "I know of no present relationship with BCCI. I know of no future relationship." The deal went through. Clifford became chairman of the newly renamed First American Bank Shares. Altman was named president, and their law firm was retained as general counsel to the bank, collecting legal fees of several $1 million. A 1991 Federal Reserve report showed that many of the 1981 investors were acting all along as fronts for BCCI. Clifford and Altman answered that they, like everyone else, had been duped. But today, Clifford and Altman were indicted on both federal and state charges for allegedly concealing their knowledge of BCCI's involvement in First American, and for enriching themselves through secret loans and other deals in the process.
At the heart of today's indictment is an alleged conspiracy by Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman to deceive federal banking regulators in order to prevent the unraveling of Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman's banking empire and to protect their millions of dollars in personal sweetheart loan transactions and stock transactions with BCCI.
The Federal Reserve Board also announced that it was beginning proceedings to decide whether to bar Clifford and Altman from ever again working in American banking. This afternoon, Clifford and Altman pleaded innocent to the New York State charges and issued a written statement, quote, "The bringing of these indictments is a cruel and unjust abuse of the prosecutorial function. Instead of these charges being based on reliable and credible evidence, they are the result of mean-spirited suspicion and unfounded speculation. The prosecutors have no credible direct evidence of any wrongdoing by us. There are no smoking guns. We understand the prosecution's case is based entirely on circumstantial evidence. We totally and categorically deny all charges. These cases reflect an intense competition that developed between New York, Justice, and the Federal Reserve, each seeking public acclaim for their role in fighting BCCI corruption and to deflect criticism for past failings. we became the most visible, convenient targets for government bodies that wish to demonstrate that BCCI wrongdoers will be brought to justice. In the process, however, political considerations and public posturing have overwhelmed the merits of this matter. Disregarding the policies normally applicable to such cases, we are now confronted with multiple prosecutions by 3 powerful agencies which have enormous resources. We shall fight to establish our innocence and expose the distressing manner in which these agencies have conducted themselves. To respond to that and to lay out today's charges is the man who has led the ongoing investigation of BCCI's activities in New York. He is Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. And Mr. Morgenthau, thanks for being with us. In layman's terms, what are the crimes that you are saying, that, and I'm asking you to put it in simpler terms than you would have today at the news conferences. What crimes are you saying these 6 men committed, and in particular Mr. Altman and Mr. Clifford?
Well, they're 2 separate indictments, one involving Clifford and Altman, Nakvi, Abadi, and Foulage, and they are charged with a scheme to defraud regulators and depositors as to the true nature of the ownership and control of First American Bank shares. And incidentally, First American Bank has 42 branches in New York. You can stand on the steps of the state capitol in Albany and look east along Main Street, and you'll see two branches of First American Bank. Then there is a second. But
those names you mentioned, Mr. Nakvi and the others, are foreign nationals.
They are.
Who were officials of BCCI?
No, they were, well, Nakvi and Abadi were, the third man, Mr. Foulage, was a Kuwaiti businessman who was acting as a nominee, we allege, for BCCI. There's a second indictment, which is an enterprise corruption indictment, charging Abadi, Nakvi, Ferrone, and Foulage as being part of a corrupt enterprise whose purpose was to gain money and power throughout the world by bribing central bank officials in 10 countries, in Pakistan and in Senegal and the Ivory Coast and the Argentine and 7 other countries, to get deposits to defraud the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and other banks.
And again, the additional name in that second indictment is Mr. Ferrone, who's a
right.
Saudi businessman,
Right.
who was not specifically an official of BCCI, but who
No, he was the front man in acquiring the National Bank of Georgia and the Independence Bank and in Chino, California.
What do today's indictments represent that go beyond what you and others were saying last year? I noticed that at one point in the press news release that your office put out, that you said this is not just a criminal fraud enterprise, it's much more than that. What did you mean by that?
Well, what we said was that it was a corrupt enterprise and comes under the a New York statute which covers corrupt enterprises, and that what we're saying was not just a scheme to defraud, but really a corrupt enterprise from beginning to end in July of 1991.
And why is it something that average Americans should care about if they didn't happen to be a depositor?
Well, I think for 2 reasons.
With one of these American banks.
And this is really the reason that we got involved. The United States government and the states and cities spend literally billions of dollars to try to prevent drugs from coming into this country and then prosecuting drug dealers when they do receive the drugs. I mean, last year in New York County, we prosecuted 30,000 people for dealing in drugs and possessing drugs. It's equally important to find out who was transmitting the profits of these drug deals. And if you can't cut off that economic benefit, you can prosecute the street dealer until the cows come home. So it was very important to look at who's transmitting this money, and you can't. I don't think you can say, well, it's a foreign bank, it's a bank secrecy, it's too difficult. It also goes to the credibility of government. I mean, again,
which is supposed to be regulating these sorts of things.
Which is supposed to be regulating, and also saying, you know, are you going to go after the big guy as well as the small guy? So, I think people who deposit their money in a bank want to know who owns that bank, and they were deprived and defrauded of that information.
Let me ask you just quickly about the points in Mr. Clifford's and Mr. Altman's statement today. Among other things, they say cruel and unjust abuse of the prosecutorial function. They say you have no reliable or credible evidence. It's a mean-spirited and so on.
They will have their day in court. And under the American system, they can make all of those arguments, and if the court and the jury believe them, then the charges will be dismissed. If they don't believe them, then they'll be convicted. But I'm not going to answer that on any news media program. That's a matter, that's an argument to be made in court, and it will be made, and they will get a fair hearing.
So when they say circumstantial evidence, no direct credible evidence, unfounded speculation?
They will have their day in court to make that argument, and if they're correct, they will be acquitted. If they're not, they'll be convicted.
What about their other point? One of their other points, this reflects this intense competition, they say, that was underway between your office, the New York District Attorney's Office, the Justice Department, and the Federal Reserve.
That's an argument for them to make in court. But let me say this, that when we worked very closely with the Justice Department for the last 8 or 9 months. We've worked very closely with the Federal Reserve. At our announcement today was the counsel of the New York State Federal Reserve Board, key man in the Department of Justice. My executive assistant was down at the Washington announcement. We are working very closely together. I'm sure they hope we're not, but this is a cooperative venture, and we all of us in government are being paid to serve the people, and we're going to do the best job we can.
Earlier on, though, was there not criticism of the Federal Reserve, the Justice Department, for not moving quickly enough on these issues?
My memory only lasts about 9 months, and I can tell you for the last 9 months we've been working very closely together.
Was there any effort by either the attorneys for Mr. Clifford or Mr. Altman, any discussion of any sort of bargaining arrangement to work out a plea on their part on either what the charges would be or what they would plead?
When lawyers come in and talk on behalf of their clients, I don't think that should be discussed unless it's made in open court. But I can tell you that we must have had a half a dozen meetings with lawyers for Mrs. Clifford and Altman, and they had a fair hearing. I'd like to just mention that also, you know, we announced today that one of the key figures in the takeover of First American, Sheikh Kamal Adham, has pled guilty, is paying a $105 million fine but even more important, he's agreed to fully cooperate with us and with the Justice Department, agreed to testify in the grand jury and at trial if required.
Is that pivotal to this case?
It's important. I mean, this is an extremely important development. He's somebody that we could not have extradited from Saudi Arabia, very prominent man, Saudi Arabia, and the fact that he came forward, pled guilty, entered into agreement to testify is an extremely important development.
Well, Robert Morgenthau, we thank you for being with us.
Thank you for asking me.
Jim?
Now the views of two reporters who have been covering the BCCI scandal. Douglas FRANTZ of the Los Angeles Times, co-author of the book A Full-Service Bank, How BCCI Stole Billions Around the World, and Alan Friedman of the Financial Times. Mr. FRANTZ, first, there are also some federal indictments today, in addition to the ones that were made in New York. In simple terms, what do they allege?
They're fairly similar to the New York State indictments. They allege simply that Clifford and Altman concealed BCCI's ownership and control of First American Bank when they lied to the Federal Reserve Board in 1981 at the initial hearing and at various points beyond there. And they also allege in the federal indictment that Clifford and Altman concealed lucrative side financial deals that they struck with BCCI. They allege in the federal indictment that they concealed those arrangements, particularly a $10 million stock deal, in order to avoid attracting federal regulatory attention that might have brought down the curtain on this scheme earlier.
The term that the Assistant Attorney General used was sweetheart deals. What is he talking about?
Well, I think primarily he's talking about a 1986 stock transaction in which Clifford and Altman were permitted to buy $18 million worth of stock in the parent company of First American. To buy that, they used an $18 million BCCI loan in which they put up no collateral, they put up no money of their own. BCCI took all the risk, and Clifford and Altman took none. 18 months later, they sold the bulk of that stock and pocketed a $10 million profit. Now, that's a transaction in which they had no financial risk of their own. You know, I talked with a lawyer yesterday about that transaction, and he said, my clients pay me, they don't pay me off. That's a transaction that looks more like a payoff than a legal fee.
And so, but there's never been any question about that having taken place. The only question now is whether or not it's legal or not,
well,
right?
There's also a question in the federal indictment about whether Clifford and Altman told the Federal Reserve Board about that. The Federal Reserve and the indictment allege that they concealed that transaction as well from the Federal Reserve to avoid attracting attention to what was going on at BCCI and First American.
Okay, and that's a separate offense from having done it.
Yes, it is.
I see. All right, Alan Friedman, let's go into this. Some of the, as Judy said, Mr. Altman and Mr. Clifford have not made a statement, or not spoken today in person, but they've issued this written statement, and they're supposed to have a news conference in the morning. But what about this idea of the intense competition that they allege that existed between the Justice Department and the New York people, as well as the Federal Reserve? Is there anything to that from your perspective? You've been on this story from almost the very beginning.
Yeah, I've covered this story, and I don't think I've perceived competition as such. I think I've always perceived the Federal Reserve doing an excellent job. I've certainly perceived Mr. Morgenthau's office being miles ahead of anyone else in the world on this case. And I have to be honest and say that 1 year ago, the Justice Department was accused by Mr. Morgenthau and by others, and I think rightly so, of dragging its feet. The New York District Attorney was way ahead of the indictments, brought a year ago today the first massive fraud indictments. The Attorney General Thornburg and now Mr. Barr have come under enormous criticism. Mr. Morgenthau was very diplomatic before, and he said his memory only goes back 9 months. The truth is the Bush administration has come under a lot of criticism for not prosecuting. There have been questions raised about whether this had to do with former CIA connections with BCCI or what. It's not clear. The point is there has not been competition. There's been problems.
Yeah. Mr. FRANTZ, what about the idea that, of what Mr. Morgenthau said, that at least from the last 9 months, there has been superb cooperation? Does your reporting bear that out?
Oh, sure, it does. It bears out the earlier problems that Alan mentioned. And when Bill Barr became Attorney General, he responded to the criticisms by moving this up to the front burner. He put Bob Mueller, the head of his criminal division, in charge of it, and they finally got after the BCCI case the way they well could have in October of 1988 when the first federal indictments against BCCI were brought down in Tampa.
All right. All right, let's talk about the evidence here. Both of you, as I say, have followed this case. Alan Friedman, is there a smoking gun here, or if there's not a smoking gun, what is it, based on your knowledge, that the government, the federal government, the state government, the Federal Reserve have in a general way to back up these very serious charges against these people?
Well, I think my understanding is that both the New York District Attorney and the federal government are in possession of a series of statements and filings made by Messrs. Clifford and Altman on behalf of First American and on behalf of their clients to the bank regulators. So that's on the record. We know that Mr. Clifford repeatedly said there was no BCCI involvement. But there also, and
excuse me, now, the reason that is important, because if he made a certain statement, then what they have to do is prove that he knew otherwise when he made that statement, and that statement was false when he made it, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
But also we're looking at a strange, what they call a triple role that Clifford and Altman filled. Clifford and Altman were, at the same time, the people who were brought in by Burt Lance to originally help take over this bank in Washington. They served as lawyers to BCCI. They served as lawyers to First American. They served as chairman and president of First American. They had a whole melange of roles that seemed to conflict at times, and it's very hard for the average man on the street to imagine them not knowing this. But furthermore, their documents, which I've seen and which the Senate has released, and maybe they're in the evidence that Mr. Morgenthau has, I don't know, that clearly show Mr. Altman, at least, being privy to a series of BCCI meetings around the world, in Vienna and elsewhere, where they're talking about First American as part of our family. There you have Mr. Altman sitting together with Mr. Abity and these BCCI people, supposedly not knowing anything about their ownership of the American bank, and instead they're planning how to hire a vice president. They're getting into a lot of detail. That may be circumstantial, but it's certainly interesting.
Well, anything to add or subtract from that?
I think if there's not a smoking gun, there may now be a smoking sheik. We have Kamal Adham, the former head of Saudi intelligence, who's now agreed to plead guilty and cooperated. That's very important. Documents are difficult for juries to understand. Documents, even signed papers, can be disputed by defense attorneys. But if you've got Kamal Adham sitting there talking about a decade's worth of meetings with Clark Clifford, Robert Altman, Aga Hassan Abadi, and the rest of the crew, I think you've got a very potentially important and potent witness.
And doesn't that immediately take it out of this complicated situation that the average person, oh my goodness, I'll never understand that, but they can understand that?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I don't view this story as quite so complicated. I mean, I think this is a story of Clark Clifford acting as a front for a foreign bank that had been refused permission to buy banks in the United States because they were shrouded in rumor and mystery, because we didn't know anything about their money, because they weren't regulated. They were refused permission. They hired Clark Clifford. He became their front. He said everything's okay. And so they secretly were allowed to come in here and buy 3 U.S. banks and a big chunk of a savings and loan down in Florida.
But the issue, of course, as you said, Alan Friedman, is that Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman have said in testimony before the Senate of the United States and elsewhere that they were duped, that they did not know what was going on, that these awful people who ran BCCI had them just like they had other people. And that's where this whole case is going to revolve around, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman have made several appearances in Congress. There's been a great deal of showmanship. They brought Linda Wonder Woman Carter in there, a lot of photographers, a lot of television, and they've said Mr. Clifford's basic argument is he holds his hand up and he says, trust me, my conscience is clear, I've advised every president since Harry Truman, trust me. That may not be good enough in court. I'd like to just quickly come back to that other point about Sheikh Adam. Doug is right. Very important. If that sheikh testifies against Clark Clifford and Robert Altman, as I think he may well, because he is cooperating with the prosecutors, that's very compelling stuff. And this is a very influential Saudi sheikh. A very important development, that.
And very high up, Mr. FRANTZ, in this whole operation. In other words, he wasn't a peripheral character. Is that correct?
He was one of the initial investors in BCCI, and he was one of the initial and largest investors in First American, in that group that took it over in 1981. Adham has been there from the start. And Adham is a very curious character because, as we mentioned earlier, he was the former head of Saudi intelligence. He had very strong ties to the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. And as you look beyond sort of the headlines on this scandal, I think we may, through his participation, learn a little bit more about the CIA's involvement in this bank as well.
But the allegation about the CIA, which the CIA has denied, is, for the record, is that they were may have been one of its customers, not that they were manipulating anything. Is that not correct? In other words, they used the BCCI maybe to transfer money around.
That's what they've said. I think they used BCCI for other means also. One of the things they used it for is as a window on certain terrorist operations around the world. They watched Abu Nidal and his organization through the London offices of BCCI. And I think there may still be some more to come out about.
But is that necessarily an evil thing? Is what I'm suggesting?
No, I don't. Not necessarily. I don't believe the CIA was manipulating or running BCCI.
Yeah. You have anything to add to that, Alan Friedman?
Well, I would only point out that the CIA used BCCI for legitimate operations, but we also have found a lot of evidence that BCCI was used in illegal operations like Iran-Contra. And I agree with Doug, a lot more is going to come out in future on that.
And that's my final question. In a word, Alan Friedman, is everything going to come out? Is the thing now in motion now? Are we going to know what happened and what did not happen on BCCI?
I think it's going to take years and years before before we get near 3/4 of the story. Mr. Morgenthau said this morning we're at 50% of the story. I think we still need to understand relations with the CIA. We still need to understand relations with American politicians. There's a lot more to come. The BCCI story is by no means over.
You agree?
I do agree, but this was one of the most important developments along the way, the indictment of Clifford and Altman.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both very much.